Hi there, John Wilkinson and History Made Easier. In deciding to look at the way World War II unfolded, I thought a really interesting way into this for you guys would be to use this super book by Ian Kershaw called Fateful Choices, in which he looks at fateful choices made by world leaders that really dictated the path that World War II took. It's a super read. Maybe not right now for you guys because it's quite specific. It's a big book. How many pages? I don't know. Getting on for 500 pages. And there's lots going on in your lives right now. But one day, if history has really grabbed your attention, do pick up this book, do read it. It not only explains why World War II unfolded the way it did, but it gives you a really good insight into the way top historians approach this subject. A really super read. I'm going to give you a flavour of that. And I'm going to read some pieces from Ian Kershaw's foreword to the book, and then I'll go into a PowerPoint presentation to outline those fateful decisions that he examines. This is what Ian Kershaw writes. The chapters that follow examine a number of interlinked political decisions with immense and dramatic military consequences between May 1940 and December 1941 that transformed the two separate wars. He's referring to the war in the East and the war in Europe, that transformed the two separate wars in different continents into one truly global conflagration, a colossal conflict with genocide and unprecedented barbarism at its centre. Of course, by December 1941, the war still had far to run. Many vagaries were still to occur over the course of the war. Obviously, other crucial decisions, though mainly strategic and tactical, were yet to be taken. And towards the war's end, with Allied supremacy now assured, the geopolitical framework of the post-war settlement, the basis of the Cold War, soon to emerge, was laid down in the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. But the remaining 3.5 years of the war would nevertheless essentially play out the consequences of the decisions taken between May 1940 and December 1941. These were indeed fateful decisions, decisions that changed the world. The choices made by the leaders of Germany, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, Japan and Italy, countries with very different political systems and different decision-making processes, two fascist, two democratic, one communist and one bureaucratic authoritarian, fed from and were interwoven with each other. How were these decisions reached? And then he goes on to identify a number of really important questions. I'll give you just a flavour of some of them. How far were decisions preformed by government bureaucracies? How rational were the decisions? What influences were brought to bear on those responsible for the decisions? What role was played by the individuals at the centre of the decision-making process? And how greatly did this differ within the varying political systems? And more really interesting questions. And then he goes on to make another really important point. Perhaps even more than in history generally, there is an almost inbuilt teleological impulse which leads us to presume that the way things turned out is the only way that they could have turned out. It is part of the purpose of this book to show that this was not the case. A decision implies that there were choices to be made, alternatives available. To the actors concerned, even the most ideologically committed or blinkered, vital considerations were at stake. Crucial assessments to be made, big risks to be taken. There was no inexorable path to be followed. In each case, therefore, the book asks why a particular option rather than an alternative was chosen. A very, very important point, one of the things I repeatedly try to make in class: history was never inevitable. There are always choices to be made. And then I just want to tie up at what he says at the very end of his foreword. Just one more sentence, and then I'll get on to my presentation. He says millions of lives would be lost in the process. Another so important point in history. History is always about people. Millions of lives would be lost in the process. Destruction wrought on a scale never known in history. The end was far away, but the path towards it had been laid out by the fateful choices made in 1940 and 1941. Great Britain decides to fight on. Spring 1940. Britain could most likely have negotiated a peace with Hitler in the spring of 1940. Hitler wanted it, and the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, wanted it too. And Churchill, only just made Prime Minister, was not in a strong position as the cabinet debated what to do. It would have been difficult to reach terms, but if there was the will, then terms could most probably have been reached. But Churchill won the day, and Britain fought on. On June the 4th, a defiant Churchill gave one of his most famous speeches, declaring that Britain would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets, and in the hills too, adding the rallying cry, "We shall never surrender." It was words used to bolster the British people and to send a warning to Hitler, though in truth the British had little other than its navy to back up his words. But with Britain still in the fight, Hitler had a critically important choice to make, as would Roosevelt. Hitler decides to attack the Soviet Union the summer and autumn 1940. As far as Hitler was concerned, there was always going to be a war with Russia. He had wanted Britain on board, or at least as a passive onlooker, but Churchill's Britain would have nothing to do with him. There was no way Hitler was going to prioritise the campaign in North Africa, as some in the military had urged. This would be about Lebensraum. It would be about making Germany a great power, the dominant power in Europe. And it was always about ideology. It was what Hitler had always been calling for some 20 years now. Besides, Hitler was convinced it was the only way to secure complete victory. This is what he told his military chiefs at a meeting at the end of July. Britain's hope lies in Russia and the United States. If the hopes pinned on Russia are disappointed, then America too will fall by the wayside, because elimination of Russia would tremendously increase Japan's power in the Far East. Russia is the factor on which Britain is relying the most. With Russia smashed, Britain's last hope would be shattered. Germany will then be master of Europe and the Balkans. And like von Moltke, the German Chief of General Staff at the infamous War Council in 1912, Hitler knew that it was better to attack the Soviet Union sooner rather than later, before the Soviet Union had built up its defences and before America entered the war. But victory had to be achieved quickly, and Hitler wouldn't be in control of the choices others made. Japan decides to seize the golden opportunity, the summer and autumn of 1940. Japan couldn't withdraw from China without being humiliated, and that wasn't an option for the Japanese government. Japan had to assert itself if it was to be a great power, and that is how Japan saw itself and wanted the rest of the world to see it. But as Ian Kershaw puts it, America saw Japan as a belligerent, bullying, imperialist force. And in truth, Japan saw itself that way too. Matsuoka Yosuke, the day before he became Japan's foreign minister in July 1940, in an interview with an American journalist, talked of how in the battle between democracy and totalitarianism, it was totalitarianism that would win. And he added that he thought a confrontation between Japan and America was inevitable. Japan was not going to miss the opportunity to become self-sufficient. Manchuria was clearly only the beginning, and it had all but decided that Southeast Asia would be next. There was an alternative: attack Russia from the east as Germany attacked it from the west. That was certainly what Hitler wanted to happen, but the prizes were greater to the south. And so, on September the 27th, 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, a defensive pact but clearly aimed against America. Japanese troops had already moved into French Indochina. It seemed to the Japanese that Germany's stunning victories in Europe had presented it with an opportunity that it had to take. Mussolini decides to grab his share, the summer and autumn 1940. Mussolini and most of the Italian elite regarded Italy as a have-not nation. It didn't have a strong economy, and it wasn't a power to be reckoned with. Why? Because it didn't have an empire. This was always a goal for Mussolini and his fellow fascists. But with the war seemingly won by Germany, now seemed the time for Italy to grab its share of empire. A Mediterranean empire, starting with Greece, seemed within reach. That Italy was not equipped for a major war, surely Abyssinia and Spain had shown as much, was ignored by the overwhelming craving for national glory. And for Mussolini, it was a chance to step out of Hitler's shadow. But Italy would prove a burden for Hitler, as he would repeatedly need to come to Italy's assistance, dragging much-needed manpower and resources generally away from his own targets. For example, almost 1 million men were committed to bailing out the Italians in Greece, just as Hitler was making his plans to invade Russia. Roosevelt decides to lend a hand. the summer of 1940 and the spring of 1941. Roosevelt played a difficult balancing act. He knew that most Americans favoured neutrality, though this would shift as the war progressed, and he also knew that America needed democracy to prevail over fascism. He was also under pressure from Churchill to enter the fray. There would be almost 2,000 communications between the two leaders in one form or another during the war. And Roosevelt also faced re-election in 1940, and it would be a controversial campaign as Roosevelt was standing for an unprecedented third time. Indeed, he couldn't even be sure of the Democratic nomination. So Roosevelt had to tread carefully. When the war began, Roosevelt felt he had four options: enter the war immediately, enter it when it is forced to do so, enter the war but only by supplying the democracies and providing naval and air support, or stay out of the war but support the democracies, essentially Britain. And in fact, what unfolded was that Roosevelt, and he won the nomination and the election, moved America step by step away from neutrality, increasing support for the British. The Lend Lease bill, the most important of these steps, Churchill hailed it as an intense turning point, was passed in March 1941, but only after 3 months of heated debate in Congress. America had not declared war, but it had declared who it was supporting in the war, and it had, in effect, declared economic war. America had indeed become the arsenal of democracy, a phrase Roosevelt had used at the end of 1940. But let me quote Roosevelt's speech at the White House Correspondents' Association dinner of that year. This is what he says: "Let not the dictators of Europe or Asia doubt our unanimity now. The entire country had engaged in a great debate. Yes, the decisions of our democracy may be slowly arrived at, but when that decision is made, it is claimed not with the voice of any one man, but with the voice of 130 millions. It is binding on us all, and the world is no longer left in doubt. This decision is the end of any attempts at appeasement in our land, the end of urging us to get along with dictators, the end of compromise with tyranny and the forces of oppression. And the urgency is now. We believe that when our production output is in full swing, the democracies of the world will be able to prove that dictatorships cannot win." Now, in that rather lengthy intro to this piece, I forgot to mention that Ian Kershaw identifies 10 fateful choices in total, and I'm covering these 10 choices in 2 parts. So this is the end of the first part, and I'll sit down and cover the other 5 in another piece.